The fashion mogul's eyes welled with tears as she held up the simple straw sunhat, now transformed into a crown jewel of her billion-dollar empire. "This," she announced to the stunned crowd of reporters and industry titans, "was given to me by a man who had nothing to his name but the soil beneath his feet and the sky above his head. And yet, he offered it freely, when I needed it most." Behind her, the weathered farmer shifted uncomfortably in his new clothes, still unable to comprehend how a single act of kindness had catapulted him from the brink of bankruptcy into the blinding spotlight of international fashion. Little did he know, his journey was just beginning. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The sun beat down mercilessly on Mason Reed's sunburnt neck. As he straightened his aching back and squinted across his struggling cornfields, 20 acres of crops that should have been knee-high by now barely reached his ankles, stunted by the worst drought to hit Willow Creek County in 60 years. His weathered hand instinctively reached for the frayed straw sunhat that had protected him through 15 farming seasons. Adjusting it slightly as sweat trickled down his temples. At 35, Mason felt twice his age, the weight of impending foreclosure bending his shoulders more than any physical labor ever could. "Looking rough out there," called a sympathetic voice. Mason turned to see his closest neighbor, Henry Davidson, leaning against his pickup truck at the edge of the property line. Unlike Mason, who had inherited his modest family farm after his father's passing 3 years ago, Henry had diversified early, adding solar panels and a small wind farm to his agricultural operations. The older man's farm wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. 3 months without decent rain," Mason replied, walking toward the fence line separating their properties. "County Extension Office says we might get some next week, but I'll believe it when I see it." He didn't mention the letter from Heartland Bank sitting unopened on his kitchen table. The third notice about his delinquent mortgage payments. Pride was sometimes all a man had left when everything else was failing. Henry's eyes, kind but shrewd from decades of weathering agricultural market fluctuations, took in Mason's worn boots and the patches on his jeans. Heard Williams down the road, sold to that development company. Got himself a nice payout. The implication hung in the air between them. Mason's jaw tightened slightly. Good for him. I'm not ready to give up just yet. The Reed farm had been in his family for 4 generations. His great-grandfather had survived the Dust Bowl here. His grandfather had weathered the farm crisis of the 1980s. His father had fought off corporate buyout offers until his dying day. The land wasn't just soil and crops to Mason. It was legacy, identity, purpose. "Just saying, options are good to have," Henry said with a shrug, clearly not wanting to press the point. "Anyway, came by to see if you wanted to join us for dinner tonight. Addie's making her famous pot roast." Mason managed a genuine smile. Henry and Adelaide Davidson had taken him under their wing after his father passed, offering advice, occasional help with equipment, and regular dinner invitations that ensured he ate something besides microwaved meals at least once a week. "Wouldn't miss it. Need me to bring anything?" "Just yourself." 6 o'clock. Henry climbed back into his truck, the engine roaring to life. "And Mason," he added through the open window, "don't forget, droughts don't last forever. Neither do the good times. It's all cycles." As Henry's truck disappeared in a cloud of dust down the rural road, Mason returned to his inspection of the cornfields. He pulled a pocket knife from his jeans and carefully cut open a stalk, examining the moisture content within. Too dry. Even with irrigation from his well, which was itself dangerously low, the plants were struggling. He'd already lost 20% of his anticipated yield, and if rain didn't come soon, that number would climb higher. Back at the modest farmhouse that needed a fresh coat of paint and several repairs, Mason washed up at the kitchen sink. The house was quiet, except for the occasional creaking of old wood settling in the afternoon heat. He sometimes wondered if the solitude was worse than the financial stress. These empty rooms that had once been filled with family. His mother had passed when he was in high school, and he'd never gotten around to marriage. There had been relationships, including a serious one with his high school sweetheart, Olivia. But she'd eventually chosen a life beyond Willow Creek, and he couldn't blame her. Farming wasn't just a job, It was an all-consuming lifestyle that not everyone was cut out for. Mason glanced at his watch. Noting that he had a few hours before dinner at the Davidsons, he decided to drive into town for some supplies and to check mail at the post office. His battered pickup truck protested briefly before the engine caught, the air conditioning long since broken. Rolling down the windows, he navigated the dusty road toward Willow Creek, a small agricultural town that had seen better days. Main Street in Willow Creek featured the usual establishments: a diner, hardware store, post office, small grocery, and a bank. The sidewalks were mostly empty in the afternoon heat, with most sensible people finding indoor shelter from the relentless sun. Mason parked in front of Garrison's Hardware, nodding at Joe Garrison himself as he entered the store. "Mason," Joe greeted him. "Just got in those irrigation parts you were asking about last week." "Appreciated, Joe. Hoping I won't need them if this rain comes through." Mason browsed through the store, picking up a few essentials and some repair supplies for a leaky pipe in his bathroom. The prices made him wince internally, each purchase carefully weighed against his dwindling bank account. At the checkout counter, Joe rang up his items with the familiar efficiency of a man who'd been doing the same job for decades. "Heard anything about that fancy lady asking questions around town?" he asked casually. Mason frowned. "What fancy lady?" "Some city woman been around past couple days. Real put-together type. Asking about local farms, history of the area. Garrison Women's Group hosted her for tea yesterday, though nobody seems to know exactly who she is or why she's here." Joe bagged the purchases. "Thought maybe she was from one of those development companies, but she didn't seem the type. Too refined," Miley said. Mason shrugged. "Probably just passing through." Willow Creek wasn't exactly a tourist destination, but occasionally they'd get visitors researching genealogy or photographers looking for authentic rural landscapes. After settling his bill, Mason crossed the street to the post office, collecting mostly bills and agricultural catalogs from his box. He was turning to leave when the glass door swung open, momentarily blinding him with the flood of sunlight that preceded a new arrival. The woman who stepped inside was immediately, obviously out of place in Willow Creek. Her linen dress was simple but clearly expensive, its pristine cream color standing in stark contrast to the practical, often dust-stained clothing of most town residents. Dark sunglasses perched on top of sleek, shoulder-length black hair, and despite the rural setting, her leather sandals looked like they belonged on a Mediterranean vacation rather than a drought-stricken farming town. Mason nodded politely as he passed her. The ingrained courtesy of rural living. The woman returned his nod with a polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, which Mason noticed were an unusual shade of amber brown, almost golden in the fluorescent lighting of the post office. There was something familiar about her that he couldn't quite place, a nagging sense of recognition that he dismissed as imagination. Outside, the heat hit him like a physical force after the air-conditioned interior of the post office. Mason was climbing into his truck when he noticed the same woman exit the building, looking disoriented in the glare of the afternoon sun. She fumbled in her designer handbag, presumably searching for her sunglasses, then looked up at the sky with a pained expression. Something about her obvious discomfort triggered Mason's instinctive hospitality. In his truck bed was his spare work hat, not as worn as his favorite but still serviceable. Without overthinking it, he grabbed it and approached her. "Ma'am," he said, holding out the straw sun hat. "Looks like you could use some shade. Sun's brutal this time of day." The woman turned toward him, surprise evident on her features. For a moment, she seemed to struggle for words, as though the simple offer had genuinely caught her off guard. "That's very kind of you," she finally said, her voice carrying the polished accent of someone educated far from rural America. "Are you sure? Got another?" Mason replied with a shrug. "It's nothing fancy, but it'll keep the sun off." After a brief hesitation, she accepted the hat, placing it carefully on her head. The simple straw sun hat should have looked ridiculous paired with her elegant attire, but somehow she made it work, adjusting it with the unconscious grace of someone accustomed to being photographed. "Thank you. I'm afraid I came unprepared for quite how intense the sun would be here. Not from around these parts, I guess?" Mason asked, though the answer was obvious. A smile played at the corner of her mouth. "Is it that obvious?" she asked, amusement warming her tone. "No, I'm just visiting. Research project, of sorts." Mason nodded, not pressing for details. "Well, welcome to Willow Creek. Not much to see, but folks are friendly enough." "I've noticed that," she said, her eyes studying him with an intensity that made him slightly uncomfortable. "I'm Alexandra, by the way. Alexandra Chen." She extended her hand in a formal gesture that seemed at odds with their surroundings. "Mason Reed," he replied, shaking her hand briefly, noting its softness against his calloused palm. "Enjoy your stay, Ms. Chen." Before she could respond, his phone rang. Checking the screen, Mason saw it was Henry, probably calling about dinner arrangements. "Excuse me," he said, turning away to answer. The call was brief, Henry asking if Mason could come a bit earlier to help move some furniture before Adelaide served dinner. When Mason turned back, Alexandra Chen was walking away down the sidewalk, his spare sun hat providing a shield against the relentless sun. Something about her gait, confident and purposeful, suggested she was a woman accustomed to knowing exactly where she was going and what she wanted when she got there. Mason watched her for a moment longer than necessary, then shook his head and climbed into his truck. The brief encounter was already fading from his mind, displaced by more immediate concerns about his failing crops, mounting debts, and how to politely refuse if Henry tried again to suggest he consider selling the Beichi farm. The simple straw sun hat was forgotten entirely, one insignificant gift among the dozens of small kindnesses that rural people regularly extended to strangers and neighbors alike. Mason had no way of knowing that this particular kindness, offered without thought of reward or recognition, would return to him in ways he couldn't possibly imagine. Alexandra Chen walked purposefully down the main street of Willow Creek, the borrowed sun hat providing blessed relief from the afternoon sun. Her rental car was parked in front of the small local cafe, but she wasn't ready to leave yet. Instead, she found herself drawn to a bench under the sparse shade of a struggling maple tree in the town's modest central square. The hat was rough against her fingertips as she adjusted it, nothing like the meticulously crafted designer pieces that regularly adorned models in her company's fashion shows. And yet, there was something authentic about it that appealed to her professional eye, the honest functionality of an object made purely for practical purposes rather than status or style. Alexandra withdrew a small leather notebook from her handbag and began making notes, occasionally glancing around at the storefronts surrounding the square. To any observer, she might have looked like a tourist or perhaps a journalist, but her purpose in Willow Creek was far more personal than professional, though the two had become unexpectedly intertwined in recent weeks. The notification sound from her phone interrupted her thoughts. Alexandra sighed, knowing before she checked that it would be Diane, her executive assistant, with some crisis requiring immediate attention. The fashion industry never slept, and as CEO of Chen Luxe, one of the fastest-growing luxury apparel companies in the world, Alexandra was accustomed to constant demands on her attention. Sure enough, Diane's message detailed an issue with their Milan supplier and 3 interview requests from major fashion publications, all marked urgent. Alexandra typed a brief response, directing Diane to handle the supplier issue according to protocols they'd established and to schedule the interviews for after her return. She deliberately didn't specify when that return would be. Across the square, Alexandra noticed the farmer who had given her the hat-loading supplies into his truck. "Mason Reed," he'd said. There was something compelling about him, a quiet dignity, despite the obvious signs of financial struggle evident in his worn clothing and the patches on his ancient truck. He worked with an efficiency of movement that spoke of someone intimately familiar with physical labor, so different from the fashionable posturing that dominated Alexandra's world. She watched as he helped an elderly woman with her groceries, loading them into a car before returning to his own tasks, the small kindness offered as naturally as breathing. These observations were precisely why Alexandra had insisted on coming to Willow Creek personally, despite her board's confusion and her executive team's protests. Some things couldn't be understood through market research reports and demographic analyses. As Mason's truck pulled away, Alexandra returned to her notes, adding details about the unself-conscious community interactions she'd witnessed. After 20 minutes, she closed her notebook, satisfied with her observations for the day. Rising from the bench, she walked to her rental car, placing the borrowed Sunhat carefully on the passenger seat. The contrast between her sleek rental and the dusty, practical vehicles lining Main Street wasn't lost on her. Alexandra had grown up in environments similar to this, though much further west, before her life had taken unexpected turns toward educational opportunities, international travel, and eventually the upper echelons of the fashion world. Her connection to rural America was a closely guarded personal history, known to very few in her professional circle. As she pulled away from Willow Creek, Alexandra found herself contemplating the Sunhat and its owner far more than was reasonable. She'd encountered plenty of kind strangers during her research trip through rural America, but something about Mason Reed's straightforward generosity had struck a chord. Perhaps it was the lack of calculation behind it, the absence of the networking motives that accompanied most kindnesses in her usual world. Whatever it was, Alexandra made a mental note to ensure the hat was returned before she left the area permanently. It was a small thing, but in her experience, it was often the small, seemingly insignificant details that made all the difference, both in fashion design and in human connections. Back at his farm, Nason spent the remaining afternoon hours checking irrigation lines and calculating how to stretch his water resources if the drought continued. The math was discouraging. Without significant rainfall soon, he wouldn't have enough groundwater to sustain even half his crops through to harvest. The financial implications made his stomach clench, but he pushed the anxiety aside, focusing instead on the immediate tasks that needed attention. By the time he showered and changed for dinner at the Davidsons, the brief encounter with the elegant stranger in town had been relegated to the very back of his mind, displaced by more immediate concerns. The spare Sunhat wasn't missed, its absence not even registered amid the much larger worries weighing on him. The Davidsons' farm stood in stark contrast to Mason's struggling property. Solar panels glinted on outbuilding roofs, a small wind turbine spun lazily on a distant hill, and despite the drought, their fields appeared healthier, protected by more advanced irrigation systems that Henry had invested in during better years. It wasn't a large operation, but it was diversified and adaptable in ways that Mason's traditional approach was not. Adelaide Davidson greeted him at the door with a warm hug, her plump figure and perpetually flour-dusted apron a comforting constant in Mason's life. "Right on time," she said, ushering him inside. "Henry's got his back acting up again, so I'm glad you're here to help with that china cabinet he's suddenly decided needs moving." Mason smiled. "Happy to help. Though I've never known a man more stubborn about asking for help than your husband." "Pot, kettle," Adelaide replied with a knowing look, handing him a glass of iced tea. "You rid men could give lessons in pig-headedness." The gentle rebuke contained years of affection. Adelaide had been close friends with Mason's mother and had stepped into a quasi-maternal role after her passing, especially once Mason returned to the farm following his father's death. She was one of the few people who could call him out on his own stubbornness without raising his defenses. Henry was in the living room, ostensibly studying the position of an antique china cabinet, but actually trying to mask the pain evident in his stiff posture. "Mason," he greeted. "Just in time. Addie's got it in her head that this monstrosity needs to go across the room." Between them, they managed to relocate the heavy furniture without incident, though Mason noted with concern how Henry winced when he thought no one was looking. The older farmer was pushing 70, still working land that should have been managed by a son or daughter. But the Davidsons' only child, a daughter named Rachel, had pursued a medical career in Chicago, returning home only for holidays and brief visits. During dinner, conversation flowed easily, a comfortable familiarity built over shared meals and mutual respect. Adelaide's pot roast was, as always, perfect, tender enough to cut with a fork and seasoned with herbs from her kitchen garden. "Saw that fancy rental car in town today," Henry mentioned between bites. "Hear anything about who's driving it?" Mason hesitated, then remembered his brief interaction. "Met the woman briefly at the post office. Said her name was Alexandra Chen. Something about a research project." Adelaide's eyes lit up with interest. "She came to the women's auxiliary meeting yesterday. Didn't say much about herself, but asked all sorts of questions about local farming practices, how the community's changed over the years. Very polite, educated type." Probably another academic writing a paper on the dying rural America or some such nonsense, Henry grumbled. Get a few of those through here every year, studying us like we're some endangered species. I don't think so, Adelaide replied thoughtfully. There was something different about her. Genuine interest, not just academic curiosity. And did you see her hands? Soft as a baby's, but there were old calluses underneath, like someone who grew up working hard now, but hasn't had to in a long while. Mason found this observation interesting but didn't comment. The mysterious Alexandra Chen was likely just passing through, another brief visitor to their struggling community who would soon return to whatever privileged life she normally inhabited. As dinner concluded, the conversation inevitably turned to the drought and its impact on local farms. Williams wasn't the only one who sold, Henry said soberly. Henderson signed papers yesterday. That development company's offering good money, considering the state of things. Mason stiffened slightly. The same developers who've been sending me letters every month? Horizon Group? Probably, Henry confirmed. They're looking to build some kind of planned community. Houses, shops, even talked about an artificial lake, calling it Green Valley Estates or some such nonsense. The irony of the name wasn't lost on Mason. There would be nothing green or natural about it, just another cookie-cutter development, erasing generations of agricultural history. Well, they can keep sending letters. I'm not interested. Adelaide and Henry exchanged a glance that Mason pretended not to notice. Nobody's saying you should sell, Mason, Adelaide said gently. But there's no shame in considering all options. Your father was as stubborn as they come, God rest his soul, but even he would want you to make practical decisions. Dad would never have sold, Mason replied, more sharply than he intended. This land has been in our family since before the county was even established. Henry sighed. Times change, son. Farming's not what it was when your great-grandfather homesteaded this land. Between climate shifts, corporate agriculture, and profit margins thin as paper, it's a wonder any small farms survive. We've weathered tough times before, Mason insisted. This drought won't last forever. No. But the next challenge will come right after, Henry said, not unkindly. I'm not saying give up. Just know when fighting might cost more than it's worth. The conversation left Mason unsettled, a familiar discomfort that had been growing over recent months. Later, driving home under a vast canopy of stars, he couldn't help wondering if Henry was right. Was he fighting a losing battle? Was his determination to preserve the family farm noble persistence, or simply foolish pride? The farmhouse was dark and quiet when he arrived home, the emptiness more noticeable after the warmth of the Davidsons' home. Mason switched on the porch light out of habit, though he rarely had visitors, and made his way inside. On the kitchen table, the unopened bank notice seemed to glow in the dim light, demanding attention he wasn't ready to give. Instead, Mason stepped back outside onto the porch, gazing across fields illuminated by moonlight. Despite their stunted growth, there was still beauty in the neat rows stretching toward the horizon, in the land that had sustained his family for generations. This connection to place, to history, to purpose, was something he couldn't quantify in dollars or practical considerations. It was bone deep, as much a part of him as his name. As he stood there, a slight breeze stirred, bringing the faintest scent of distant moisture. Mason lifted his face to it, a fragile hope blooming. Perhaps rain was finally coming. Perhaps things would turn around. Perhaps stubborn persistence would prove the right choice after all. Morning arrived with crushingly familiar brightness, the promised rain having detoured around Willow Creek yet again. Mason rose before dawn, as always, moving through his morning routine with practiced efficiency. Coffee brewed as he dressed in work clothes, the day's tasks already prioritized in his mind. The farm work was physically demanding, but offered little distraction from his thoughts, which kept returning to the conversations of the previous day. Developers buying up local farms. Henry's practical advice. The bank notice still sitting unopened on his kitchen table. Even the brief encounter with the mysterious Alexandra Chen floated through his mind occasionally, her evident wealth and ease a stark contrast to the striving that defined his own existence. By mid-afternoon, the heat had become oppressive, the air so dry it seemed to pull moisture from his very skin. Mason was replacing a broken section of irrigation pipe when he heard the sound of an approaching vehicle. Looking up, he was surprised to see an unfamiliar luxury SUV navigating the dusty drive to his farmhouse. Wiping his hands on a rag, Mason walked toward the vehicle, curiosity overriding his usual wariness of unexpected visitors. When the driver's door opened and Alexandra Chen emerged, his surprise doubled. She was dressed more practically today in lightweight khaki pants and a simple white blouse, though the quality of both was evident even to his untrained eye. The straw Sunhat he'd given her sat atop her dark hair, looking incongruously humble against her otherwise polished appearance. "Mr. Reed," she called, approaching with a confidence that suggested she was accustomed to being welcomed wherever she went. "I hope you don't mind my stopping by. The general store gave me directions." Mason nodded in greeting, suddenly conscious of his sweat-stained work shirt and dirt-streaked arms. "Ms. Chen, bit surprised to see you out this way." She smiled, the expression transforming her serious features. "I wanted to return your hat and thank you properly." She removed the sun hat, holding it out to him. "It saved me from quite a sunburn yesterday." "Wasn't necessary to make a special trip," Mason said, accepting the hat somewhat awkwardly. "But appreciate the thought." Alexandra glanced past him at the fields, her expression turning more serious. "The drought is taking a toll," she observed. "I've been speaking with farmers throughout the region. It seems particularly severe here." Something about her tone, the genuine concern rather than academic interest, prompted Mason to respond more openly than he normally would with a stranger. "Worst in 6 decades, according to county records. Some relief predicted next week, but forecasts have been wrong before." Alexandra nodded thoughtfully. "I noticed your irrigation system. It's traditional." The observation, while accurate, carried a hint of criticism that Mason didn't miss. "Gets water where it needs to go," he replied, a defensive edge creeping into his voice. "When there's water to be had." "Of course," she said quickly. "I didn't mean to imply. I'm just interested in sustainable farming practices. It's part of my research." Mason's curiosity finally overcame his reserve. "What exactly are you researching, if you don't mind my asking? We don't get many visitors in Willow Creek, especially ones asking questions about farming practices." Alexandra hesitated, something unreadable flickering across her features. "It's a bit complicated. Part personal project, part professional interest." She gestured toward the farmhouse. "Perhaps we could continue this conversation out of the sun? I'd be grateful for a glass of water." And I promised to explain. Mason hesitated only briefly before nodding his agreement. It wasn't often he had visitors, and despite his wariness, there was something intriguing about this polished stranger who seemed genuinely interested in local agriculture. "House isn't much to look at," he warned as he led the way. "Been meaning to fix it up, but farming doesn't leave much time for home improvements." The farmhouse's interior was clean, but showed signs of deferred maintenance and bachelor living. The furniture was old but solid, mostly pieces that had been in the Reed family for generations. Family photos lined the mantel above a fireplace that hadn't been used in years, and agricultural almanacs were stacked neatly on a side table. In the kitchen, Mason filled 2 glasses with water from the tap, apologizing that he didn't have anything fancier to offer. Alexandra accepted the water with genuine gratitude, removing her designer sunglasses and placing them on the worn kitchen table. "So," Mason said, leaning against the counter, "this research of yours?" Alexandra took a sip of water before answering. "I'm interested in how rural communities adapt to environmental and economic challenges, particularly agricultural communities." She ran her finger thoughtfully around the rim of her glass. "It's partially academic interest, but also has practical applications for my work." "Which is?" Mason prompted when she didn't elaborate. A small smile played at the corners of her mouth. "I'm in fashion, actually. CEO of Chen Lux." The name meant nothing to Mason, a fact that must have been evident on his face, because Alexandra continued without waiting for recognition. "We're a luxury apparel brand. High-end clothing, accessories, that sort of thing." Mason frowned slightly, trying to connect fashion with interest in struggling farms. not seeing the connection to drought conditions and irrigation systems. Sustainability, Alexandra replied simply. The fashion industry is one of the world's largest polluters. Cotton farming alone uses massive amounts of water and pesticides. I've been trying to move my company toward more sustainable practices, which means understanding agriculture from the ground up, so to speak. The explanation made logical sense, but Mason had the distinct impression she wasn't telling him everything. Still, it wasn't his business to pry into her motivations. Well, if you're looking for cutting-edge agricultural practices, you've come to the wrong farm. Neighbors down the road, the Davidsons, they've got solar panels. Advanced irrigation might be more what you're interested in. Alexandra's amber eyes studied him with uncomfortable intensity. Actually, traditional methods have their own value. Wisdom accumulated over generations shouldn't be discarded just because something newer comes along. She glanced around the kitchen, taking in details he no longer noticed. How long has your family farmed this land? 4 generations, Mason replied, a hint of pride creeping into his voice despite himself. Great-grandfather started with 40 acres in 1897. Families added bits and pieces over the years, when times were good. And now? Alexandra asked. Times don't look so good. The direct assessment, while accurate, stung slightly. Farming's always been cyclical. Good years, bad years. You weather the bad. Make the most of the good. Alexandra nodded slowly. That philosophy applies to many industries, though few require quite so much faith and persistence as farming. She finished her water and placed a glass carefully in the sink. Would you mind showing me around your operation, Mr. Reed? I'd like to understand how a traditional family farm functions, especially under stress conditions. Mason hesitated, torn between a farmer's natural pride in his land and embarrassment at its current state. Not much to see right now, he admitted. Crops are struggling. Equipment's mostly older models, nothing fancy. Perfect, Alexandra said, surprising him. That's exactly what I'm interested in. Reality, not a showcase. Something in her tone, a genuine respect rather than academic curiosity or pity, decided him. All right then, tour won't take long, but you're welcome to see what there is to see. For the next hour, Mason showed Alexandra around his modest operation. The tour included his equipment barn with its carefully maintained but aging machinery, the irrigation system he'd inherited and modified over years, and the fields themselves, where corn and soybeans struggled against the relentless drought. Throughout, Alexandra asked surprisingly informed questions about crop rotation, soil management, and water conservation techniques. She took occasional notes in a small leather notebook, her handwriting quick and precise. Mason found himself explaining decisions and methods he usually took for Bass. Granted, articulating the inherited wisdom and personal experience that guided his farming practices. This is remarkably efficient, given your resource constraints, Alexandra observed as they completed the circuit back to the farmhouse. You've clearly put tremendous thought into maximizing yield while minimizing waste. The praise, unexpected and seemingly genuine, caught Mason off guard. Just trying to keep things going, he said with characteristic understatement. My father was the real innovator. I'm mostly maintaining what he built. Alexandra gave him a skeptical look that suggested she didn't believe his modesty, but she didn't press the point. Instead, she reached into her handbag and withdrew a business card, offering it to him. I've taken enough of your time, Mr. Reed, but I'm grateful for the tour and insights. If you think of anything else that might be relevant to my research, please feel free to contact me. Mason accepted the card somewhat awkwardly, noting the minimalist design with just her name, title, and contact information. CEO of Chen Lux. As she'd said, the card stock was thick and obviously expensive, another reminder of the vast difference in their worlds. Appreciate your interest, he said, pocketing the card. Hope your research goes well. As Alexandra turned to go, she paused, looking back at him with an expression he couldn't quite interpret. One last question, if you don't mind. If money were no object, what changes would you make to this farm? What would sustainable success look like for you? The question caught Mason by surprise, not because it was difficult to answer, but because he'd thought about it so often. Drip irrigation throughout, he said without hesitation, solar panels to run it. Maybe wind power too, like the Davidsons have. Greenhouse for year-round growing. Diverse crops, instead of just corn and soybeans. He shrugged slightly. Wouldn't need to be fancy, just resilient. Adaptable. Alexandra nodded slowly, as though his answer confirmed something she'd already suspected. Sustainability isn't just about environmental practices, she observed. It's about creating systems that can endure through changing conditions. That applies to businesses as much as farms. With that cryptic statement, she thanked him again and returned to her vehicle. Mason watched as the luxury SUV disappeared down his dusty driveway, leaving him with a strange sense that something significant had just occurred, though he couldn't have explained what or why. That evening, after completing his chores, Mason found himself turning Alexandra Chen's business card over in his hands, curiosity finally prompting him to search for Chen Lux on his laptop. What he found surprised him. Chen Lux wasn't just a fashion company, it was apparently a major player in the luxury market, with flagship stores in New York, Paris, London, and Tokyo. Recent articles praised its innovative approach to sustainable luxury and its rapid growth under the leadership of its founder and CEO, Alexandra Chen. Several photos showed Alexandra at fashion events, looking far more glamorous than she had on his farm, but with the same intense focus in her amber eyes. One article mentioned that she was notoriously private about her background, with little known about her life before she burst onto the fashion scene with her first collection 8 years earlier. Mason closed the laptop, more confused than ever about why someone of Alexandra's status and resources would be personally researching struggling farms in a drought-stricken county. Her explanation about sustainability research made logical sense, but didn't fully account for her specific interest in Willow Creek or the personal nature of her investigation. Whatever her motives, Mason doubted he would see her again. People like Alexandra Chen moved in worlds far removed from rural farms on the edge of financial collapse. The memory of her visit would likely fade quickly, displaced by the immediate concerns of salvaging what he could from this growing season, and somehow finding a way to make the next mortgage payment. Yet as he drifted off to sleep that night, Mason found himself remembering the intensity of her gaze when she'd asked about his vision for the farm, and the way she'd listened to his answers, as though they genuinely mattered. It had been a long time since anyone had asked him about his dreams, rather than his survival strategies. 2 weeks later, the promised rain finally arrived. 3 days of steady, soaking precipitation that temporarily eased the drought's grip on Willow Creek County. Mason worked through the downpour, making necessary repairs and adjustments to capture as much of the precious moisture as possible for his struggling crops. The rain brought a cautious optimism to the farming community. At the weekly farmers market in town, where Mason sold fresh produce from the small vegetable garden he maintained primarily for his own use, the mood was noticeably lighter. Conversations focused on potential recovery rather than inevitable loss, at least for the moment. 3 days of good rain, remarked Benjamin Carter, an older farmer whose family had worked land adjacent to the reeds for generations. Might just save a portion of the season if we're lucky. Long way to go yet, Mason replied, arranging tomatoes on his modest market stand. But it's something. Heard you had a visitor out your way, Benjamin said casually, though his eyes reflected the small-town curiosity that Mason knew all too well. Fancy city woman in that expensive rental car. Mason busied himself with adjusting his produce display. Just someone doing research on sustainable farming. Nothing interesting. Benjamin raised an eyebrow. That's so? Because Ellie Garrison told my wife this woman was asking all sorts of questions about your family specifically, how long the Reeds had farmed in the county, whether any distant relatives still lived in the area. This information gave Mason pause. Alexandra Chen had indeed asked about his family's history, but he'd assumed those questions were part of her general research. The idea that she'd been specifically inquiring about the Reeds around town was unexpected and somewhat unsettling. Probably just thorough, Mason said with a shrug, unwilling to feed the rumor mill. Doubt it means anything. But Benjamin's revelation lingered in Mason's thoughts throughout the market day and followed him home afterward. Why would a fashion CEO be researching his family specifically? The whole situation felt increasingly peculiar. That evening, Mason finally opened the letter from Heartland Bank that had been sitting on his kitchen table. The contents were exactly as he'd feared, a formal notice that he was now 3 months behind on mortgage payments, with a final warning that foreclosure proceedings would begin if he didn't bring the account current within, quote, 30 days. The sum required was substantial, far more than Mason could gather from his struggling farm's income, especially with crop yields compromised by the drought. He sat at the kitchen table long into the night, reviewing his finances and exploring options, but the numbers remained stubbornly uncooperative. Even with the recent rain, the reality was stark. Without significant financial intervention, he was going to lose the farm. The realization settled like a physical weight on his shoulders. Mason found himself staring at family photographs on the mantelpiece, generations of reeds standing proudly on land he was now poised to lose. The failure felt deeply personal, as though he were betraying not just his father, but all those who had worked and sacrificed before him. After a nearly sleepless night, Mason drove into town the next morning to speak with his bank manager. The conversation at Heartland Bank was politely sympathetic, but ultimately unyielding. James Whitaker, who had known Mason's father and had handled the Reed Farm accounts for decades, explained that while he personally understood the hardships caused by the drought, corporate policy left little room for flexibility. "I'm sorry, Mason," Whitaker said, genuine regret in his voice. "If it were up to me, we'd extend the timeline, but the decision comes from regional headquarters. Best I can suggest is looking into emergency agricultural loans or—" He hesitated momentarily, considering selling at least a portion of the property. "The developer," Mason said flatly. "Horizon Group, that's what you're suggesting." Whitaker's expression confirmed the assumption. "They've made several inquiries about your property specifically. Their offers are above market value, especially considering the drought conditions." "Dad would never have sold," Mason replied, the familiar refrain sounding hollow even to his own ears. "Your father was a good man," Whitaker said carefully, "but he farmed in different times. The economics of small-scale agriculture have changed dramatically." Mason left the bank without making any decisions, the weight of impending loss accompanied now by the pressure of necessary action. Something would have to give, and soon. The thought of contacting Horizon Group sat like acid in his stomach, but he was rapidly running out of alternatives. Driving back toward the farm, Mason impulsively pulled over at the roadside mailbox, realizing he hadn't checked for mail in several days. Among the usual bills and agricultural flyers was a crisp, expensive-looking envelope addressed to him in elegant handwriting. Inside was a brief note on heavy cardstock, imprinted with the minimalist Chemlux logo he had seen during his internet search. "Mr. Reed," the note read, "thank you again for your time and insights during my visit to Willow Creek. I would appreciate the opportunity to continue our conversation about sustainable agricultural practices. If you're amenable, I'll be at the Riverside Hotel in Granville this Thursday at 7 p.m. Dinner would be my treat, in exchange for more of your expertise. Regards, Alexandra Chen." Mason read the note twice, puzzled by this unexpected follow-up. Granville was the nearest city to Willow Creek, about 45 minutes away, and the Riverside was its most upscale hotel. The invitation seemed bizarrely out of context with their previous interaction, yet something about its formality suggested it was more than a casual research follow-up. His immediate instinct was to decline. He had far more pressing concerns than discussing farming techniques with a fashion executive, however genuine her interest might be. Yet as he drove the remaining distance home, Mason found himself considering the invitation. Perhaps Alexandra Chen had connections or insights that might prove valuable in his current crisis. At the very least, the dinner would be a brief respite from the mounting pressure of potential foreclosure. By Thursday evening, Mason had made no further progress on his financial dilemma. After completing the day's farm work, he showered and changed into his one good shirt and least worn jeans, the closest thing to formal attire he owned. The drive to Granville gave him time to question his decision repeatedly, but curiosity and a vague sense that he had nothing to lose eventually overcame his reservations. The Riverside Hotel was an imposing historic building overlooking the river that gave it its name, its restored Victorian facade lit elegantly against the evening sky. Mason felt immediately out of place as he parked his battered pickup among the luxury vehicles in the parking lot. Inside, the hotel's restaurant exuded an old-world elegance, with crisp linens and soft lighting creating an atmosphere of refined comfort. Alexandra Chen was already seated at a corner table, her attention focused on a tablet she was reviewing. She wore a simple black dress that Mason suspected cost more than his monthly mortgage payment. Her dark hair swept into a sleek updo that emphasized her striking facial features. She noticed his approach immediately, setting aside the tablet and rising slightly to greet him. "Mr. Reed, thank you for coming." "Ms. Chen," Mason replied, awkwardly taking the seat a hovering waiter pulled out for him. "Must admit, your invitation was unexpected." A slight smile softened her professional demeanor. "Please, call me Alexandra. And I apologize for the formality. Professional habit, I'm afraid." The waiter appeared with menus, reciting the evening's specials with practiced precision. Mason scanned the offerings, noting with internal alarm that no prices were listed, a sure sign that everything cost more than he would normally spend on a week's groceries. Sensing his discomfort, Alexandra smoothly ordered for both of them, selecting seasonal dishes featuring locally sourced ingredients. She also requested a bottle of wine that the sommelier acknowledged with almost reverential respect. "I hope you don't mind my ordering," she said once the staff had withdrawn. "The chef here does exceptional things with regional produce." "Fine by me," Mason replied, relaxing slightly. "Though I'm still curious about why I'm here." Alexandra regarded him thoughtfully, her amber eyes assessing. "Direct approach. I appreciate that." She took a small sip from her water glass before continuing. "My visit to Willow Creek wasn't entirely what I represented it to be." This confirmation of his suspicions put Mason immediately on guard. "Oh? The sustainability research is genuine," she clarified quickly. "My company is indeed moving toward more environmentally responsible practices, but my specific interest in Willow Creek, and in your farm in particular, had an additional motivation." Before she could elaborate, the sommelier returned with the wine, going through the ritual of presentation and tasting before pouring for both of them. Mason waited, with barely concealed impatience, as the server withdrew once more. "I'm looking for my roots, Mr. Reed," Alexandra finally said, the simple statement carrying unexpected weight, both literally and figuratively. Mason frowned slightly. "Not sure I follow." Alexandra took a careful sip of her wine before responding. "I was adopted as an infant. My parents, wonderful people who gave me every advantage, were open about this fact. But they had very little information about my biological family. All they knew was that I was born at a small hospital in Willow Creek County, to a young mother who couldn't keep me." This revelation caught Mason completely off guard. "You think you're related to someone in Willow Creek? That's why you were asking about local families?" Alexandra nodded. "3 months ago, I finally decided to search for information about my birth parents. A private investigator discovered my maternal grandmother's name, Eleanor Reed." The name hit Mason like a physical blow. "Eleanor was my father's sister. She left Willow Creek right after high school, must have been nearly 40 years ago. Dad always said she wanted more than small-town life could offer." "Yes," Alexandra confirmed, watching his reaction carefully. "She moved to California, where I was born. She never married, had a brief relationship that resulted in my birth, and made the difficult decision to place me for adoption. She died in a car accident when I was 10, without ever making contact with me or, from what I understand, reconnecting with her family in Willow Creek." The implications of this information slowly crystallized in Mason's mind. "So you're saying we're cousins, once removed," Alexandra finished for him. "Eleanor was your father's sister, which makes her my maternal grandmother. And you? My first cousin once removed. I've been trying to find any living relatives for months. When the investigator discovered that the Reed family still maintained a farm in Willow Creek, I decided to come see for Aini." "Myself." Mason sat back in his chair, struggling to absorb this unexpected revelation. He had vague childhood memories of his father occasionally mentioning an estranged sister named Eleanor, but she had never visited, never been more than a name occasionally referenced with a mixture of affection and regret. "Why not just tell me this when you first came to the farm?" he asked, a hint of accusation in his tone. Alexandra's expression reflected genuine uncertainty. unusual for someone who otherwise exuded confidence. I wasn't sure how to approach it. Family estrangements are complicated, and I didn't know how you might react to a sudden claim of kinship from a stranger. I wanted to understand the situation, see the farm, meet you as a person before introducing this complication. Their conversation paused as the first course arrived, an artfully presented salad featuring produce that Mason recognized as similar to what he grew in his own garden, though transformed by the chef's skill into something far more elegant. I'm still processing this, Mason admitted after the server departed. It's not every day you discover a long-lost cousin who happens to be a fashion CEO. A genuine smile brightened Alexandra's features. Believe me, it's equally surreal from my perspective. I've spent years building an identity around my work, my adopted family, the idea of biological connections, a family history I never knew. It's both appealing and terrifying. They ate in silence for a few moments, both seemingly grateful for the respite from emotional revelations. Mason found himself studying Alexandra's features, searching for familial resemblances he might have missed. There was something in the determined set of her jaw that reminded him of his father, perhaps, and a certain quality to her amber eyes that seemed vaguely familiar. "The Sunhat," Mason said suddenly, the memory clicking into place. "When I first saw you at the post office, I had the strangest feeling I'd seen you before. Must have been the family resemblance, though I didn't recognize it as such." Alexandra nodded. "I had a similar experience. Something about you seemed familiar in a way I couldn't place." The investigator provided photos, but seeing someone in person is different. As they progressed through the meal, the initial shock gradually gave way to cautious curiosity. Alexandra shared what little she knew about Eleanor Reed's life after leaving Willow Creek, while Mason filled in details about the family history and the farm's progression through generations. Despite the vastly different paths their lives had taken, a tentative connection began to form, the faint outline of a shared heritage. When the dessert plates had been cleared and they were lingering over coffee, Alexandra finally broached the subject that had been hovering unspoken between them. "During my research, I couldn't help noticing that the Reed farm appears to be facing significant challenges. The drought, obviously, but also what seems to be financial pressure." Mason stiffened slightly. "Farm's been through tough times before." "Of course," Alexandra said carefully. "But from what I gathered speaking with locals and observing the general economic conditions in Willow Creek, many small farms are at a critical juncture. Some have already sold to developers." The reminder of his precarious situation dampened the tentative warmth that had been building between them. "If you're wondering if I'm planning to sell the family heritage, I'm not. Not if there's any alternative." Alexandra regarded him thoughtfully. "That wasn't my question. I respect your commitment to preserving the farm. What I'm wondering is whether you would be open to considering a different kind of alternative." "What kind of alternative?" Mason asked warily. "A partnership," Alexandra replied simply. "Chen Lux has been exploring vertical integration for our sustainable materials pipeline. We need reliable, ethically managed sources for natural fibers, including cotton and various plant-derived textiles." Mason frowned. "My farm primarily grows cord and soybeans. I have a small vegetable garden, but nothing suitable for textile production." "Currently, yes," Alexandra acknowledged. "But farms can evolve. The Reed land has good soil, established water rights, and generations of agricultural expertise in the form of you. With appropriate investment in infrastructure, crop transition, and modern sustainability practices, it could become exactly the kind of operation Chen Lux needs for our supply chain." End quote. The proposal was so unexpected that Mason struggled to formulate a response. "You're talking about a major transformation. Different crops, new equipment, completely different farming methods." "Yes," Alexandra confirmed. "It would require significant change and investment, but it would also preserve the Reed farm as a working agricultural enterprise rather than another suburban development. The family legacy would continue, just in an adapted form." Mason's mind raced to process the implications. "This sounds like a business proposition, not a family reunion." Alexandra's expression softened. "It's both, actually. Finding my biological family was a personal quest, one I undertook without any business motivations. But now that I've found you and learned about the farm situation, I see a potential synergy, a way to honor our shared heritage while creating something sustainable for the future." End quote. The concept was simultaneously appealing and overwhelming. "I'd need to think about this, understand the details. It's not a small decision." "Of course," Alexandra said immediately. "I wouldn't expect an immediate answer to such a significant proposal. Take whatever time you need to consider it. I can have my team prepare detailed projections and plans for you to review." As they prepared to leave the restaurant, Alexandra handed Mason a thick envelope. "Some preliminary information about what I'm proposing, along with historical documents about the Reed family that my Simmel investigator uncovered. There are photos of Eleanor you might not have seen." Mason accepted the envelope, the weight of it symbolic of the substantial revelations and proposals it contained. "Thank you for dinner," he said somewhat awkwardly. "And for, well, everything. It's a lot to process." "For me as well," Alexandra admitted with unexpected vulnerability. "Finding family isn't something I anticipated at this stage of my life." They parted in the hotel lobby with a formal handshake that somehow acknowledged both their newly-discovered familial connection and the potential business relationship hanging in the balance. Driving home through the quiet countryside, Mason's thoughts swirled with conflicting emotions and practical considerations. The farm had been in his family for generations, but it had evolved over that time, adapting to changing markets and technologies. His great-grandfather had farmed with horses before tractors transformed agriculture. His grandfather had transitioned from diverse subsistence farming to more focused cash crops. Even his father had made significant changes, adopting new irrigation methods and planting strategies. Change was part of farming's nature, Mason reflected. The question wasn't whether to change, but whether Alexandra's proposed transformation aligned with the core values that had sustained the Reed farm through generations. Stewardship of the land, connection to place, sustainable productivity. At home, Mason spread the contents of Alexandra's envelope across his kitchen table. Detailed business projections shared space with faded photographs of a young woman he recognized as his Aunt Eleanor, from the few family pictures his father had kept. The juxtaposition of past and potential future was striking, a visual representation of the decision before him. The following week brought more rain to Willow Creek County, steady precipitation that renewed hope among local farmers. Mason worked long hours in the improved conditions, trying to salvage what he could of his struggling crops, while simultaneously contemplating Alexandra's unexpected proposal. He discussed the situation with Henry and Adelaide Davidson one evening, seeking their perspective as both friends and successful farmers who had embraced innovation. "It's a remarkable opportunity," Adelaide observed after Mason explained Alexandra's proposal. "Connecting with family you never knew existed, and potentially securing the farm's future at the same time." Henry was more cautious. "Sounds promising on paper, but corporate partnerships can be complicated. Need to make sure the contract protects your interests long-term. Who controls decisions about the land? What happens if this fashion company changes direction or gets sold?" These practical questions reflected Mason's own concerns. While Alexandra's proposal offered a potential solution to his immediate financial crisis and a path toward sustainable operation, it also meant surrendering some degree of independence, the very quality that had drawn many to farming in the first place. 10 days after their dinner in Granville, Mason called the number on Alexandra's business card. Her assistant put him through immediately, suggesting she had been expecting his call. "I'd like to discuss your proposal in more detail," Mason said without preamble. "I'm interested, but I need to understand exactly what this partnership would mean for the farm and for my role in its operation." "Of course," Alexandra replied, her tone professionally pleased. "I can come to Willow Creek tomorrow, or if you prefer, you could visit our offices in New York next week. We could review everything in person, and you could see firsthand how Chen Lux approaches sustainability in our operations." The invitation to New York was unexpected. Mason had never traveled further than Chicago, and the prospect of visiting New York to tour a luxury fashion company was far outside his experience. Yet something about the opportunity appealed to him, a chance to understand Alexandra's world as she had made the effort to understand his. New York. He decided, surprising himself. If you're serious about this partnership, I should see your operation in person. 3 days later, Mason found himself on a flight to New York City, the farmland of his home giving way to urban sprawl as the plane began its descent into JFK Airport. Alexandra had arranged everything, from the flight to a hotel room near Chen Lux's headquarters in Manhattan's Fashion District. The city was a sensory overload after the quiet rhythms of Willow Creek, a cacophony of sounds, scents, and ceaseless movement that left Mason simultaneously overwhelmed and fascinated. A driver met him at the airport, navigating the chaotic traffic with practiced ease, while Mason stared through the window at the passing car. Cityscape. So utterly different from the open fields and big skies of home. The hotel was more luxurious than any accommodation Mason had ever experienced, with views of the city that transformed the urban landscape into something almost beautiful in its complex density. A welcome basket waited in his room, containing not the expected corporate promotional items, but thoughtfully selected products from small, sustainable farms across America, along with a handwritten note from Alexandra explaining the origin of each item. The gesture was unexpectedly touching, evidence that she understood what would resonate with him far better than generic luxury items. Mason spent the evening acclimatizing to the hotel room's opulence and preparing for the next day's meeting, reviewing the detailed proposal Alexandra had sent ahead and formulating questions about aspects that remained unclear. Morning arrived with renewed nervous energy. Mason dressed in the one suit he owned, purchased for his father's funeral 3 years earlier and rarely worn since. Looking at his reflection in the hotel room's full-length mirror, he felt acutely out of place. A farmer playing at business in a world where appearance seemingly mattered as much as substance. The Chen Lux headquarters occupied several floors of a sleek building in Manhattan's garment district. The reception area featured minimalist design elements that somehow managed to convey luxury through restraint rather than ostentation. Natural materials predominated, with reclaimed wood and stone creating an organic aesthetic that surprised Mason given the urban setting. Alexandra greeted him personally, emerging from an elevator to find him examining a large photograph of terraced rice fields that dominated one wall of the reception area. "My favorite image in the building," she commented, following his gaze. A reminder that agriculture is both practical necessity and art form. She looked different here, Mason noted, more polished and perhaps slightly more guarded than she had appeared in Willow Creek. Her simple black dress and minimal jewelry projected effortless sophistication, while her demeanor carried the subtle authority of someone accustomed to commanding respect. "Welcome to Chen Lux," she said, extending her hand in formal greeting despite their established familial connection. "Ready to see how the fashion side of the potential partnership operates?" The tour that followed was comprehensive, moving from design studios where artists sketched concepts and draped fabrics on mannequins, to material research laboratories where technicians tested fiber durability and environmental impact. Alexandra introduced Mason to key team members, explaining his background and the potential partnership in terms that positioned him as a valuable agricultural expert rather than a struggling farmer in need of rescue. "Our materials sourcing is the foundation of our sustainability commitment," Alexandra explained as they observed textile specialists examining sample fabrics. "We've established partnerships with producers in several countries, but we've been looking to develop American sources that align with our ethical and environmental standards." Mason nodded, recognizing the business logic: reduces transportation impact, improves supply chain resilience. "Makes sense." Alexandra smiled slightly. "Exactly. But finding producers who understand both traditional agricultural wisdom and modern sustainability practices has been challenging. Most large agricultural operations are too committed to conventional methods, while smaller operations often lack the capacity for the volume we need." The unspoken implication was clear. The Reed farm, with investment and adaptation, could occupy a sweet spot between these extremes, maintaining the values of family farming while adopting innovations that would make it commercially viable at the scale Chen Lux required. As the tour progressed to executive offices, Mason noticed how staff Tals responded to Alexandra. A mixture of respect and genuine regard. that suggested she was both demanding and fair as a leader. It aligned with his own observations of her character, the blend of business acumen and personal authenticity that had characterized their interactions. In a conference room with views of the Manhattan skyline, Alexandra's executive team joined them for a detailed presentation of the proposed partnership. Financial projections, agricultural transition plans, and infrastructure investments were outlined with professional precision, addressing many of the questions Mason had formulated. The core proposal, summarized Diane, Alexandra's executive assistant, involves a 5-year transition of the Reed farm from conventional corn and soybean production to specialized fiber crops, primarily organic cotton initially, with experimental plots for emerging sustainable fibers. Chen Lux would provide capital investment for irrigation upgrades, equipment, and operational costs during transition, while Mr. Reed would contribute his land, agricultural expertise, and management. James Wong, the company's sustainability director, continued, "We're suggesting a phased approach, converting 20% of acreage annually to minimize risk. Soil testing indicates your land is well suited for these crops, and the establishment of a processing facility in Willow Creek could create additional local employment opportunities." Mason listened attentively, occasionally asking questions about specific details or requesting clarification on technical points. The proposal was more comprehensive than he had anticipated, addressing not just the immediate financial crisis, but establishing a long-term vision for the farm that maintained its agricultural identity while transforming its focus. "What happens if the partnership doesn't work out?" he asked during a pause in the presentation. "If yields aren't what we project, or if Chen Lux's needs change?" It was Alexandra who answered, her tone serious. "The agreement includes protections for both parties. You would retain ownership of the land regardless of outcomes. If the partnership is terminated for any reason, Chen Lux would forfeit equipment investments, but you would have no obligation to repay operational funding already provided." This provision addressed one of Mason's primary concerns, the risk of losing the farm if the new direction proved unsuccessful. "And decision-making? Day-to-day operations? Agricultural decisions would remain primarily your domain," Alexandra assured him. "Our sustainability team would provide guidance on fiber quality requirements and environmental standards, but how you meet those standards would be your expertise. It's a true partnership, not a corporate takeover of a family farm." By the end of the presentation, Mason had to acknowledge that the proposal was both thorough and thoughtfully constructed to address his concerns while meeting Chen Lux's business needs. The partnership offered a viable path forward, one that would preserve the Reed farm's legacy while adapting it to changing economic and environmental realities. "We'll give you time to consider everything we've discussed," Alexander said as the meeting concluded. "I understand it's a significant decision with personal as well as professional implications." Left alone in the conference room to review documents, Mason found himself drawn to the window, gazing out at the urban landscape so different from the rural horizons he knew. The contrast between Alexandra's world and his own was stark, yet they shared a connection he was still coming to terms with, a genetic link that somehow bridged these disparate environments. That evening, Alexandra hosted a dinner for Mason at her penthouse apartment, a space that reflected her personality more intimately than the corporate headquarters. Like the Chen Lux offices, the apartment featured natural materials and restrained elegance, but personal touches humanized the design. Photography books stacked on coffee tables, a well-used kitchen that suggested she actually cooked rather than just entertained, and most surprisingly, several pieces of handmade quilts framed as artwork. "My adoptive grandmother's work," Alexandra explained, noticing Mason's interest in the textile displays. She was from rural Oklahoma originally, maintained her quilting practice even after moving to California. "She taught me basic stitching when I was young. It was my first introduction to textiles, though I didn't recognize its significance at the time." This glimpse into Alexandra's personal history added another dimension to Mason's understanding of her interest in rural craftsmanship and traditional skills. The dinner that followed was less formal than their previous meeting, with Alexandra preparing much of the meal herself while they discussed aspects of the partnership proposal and gradually explored their newfound family connection. I've been thinking about what this partnership might mean beyond business considerations, Alexandra said as they finished the meal. The Reed farm represents a family heritage we both share, even though we've experienced it very differently. There's something meaningful about collaborating to ensure its continuation, adapted for modern realities, but still grounded in the values that sustained it through generations. Mason nodded slowly, then thinking along similar lines. Dad always said the most important crop we grew was the next generation of Reeds who would care for the land. Without children of my own, I'd begun to wonder if his vision had ended with me. This partnership offers a different kind of continuity. Not replacement but evolution, Alexandra suggested, the farm continuing its story in a new chapter. The metaphor resonated with Mason's own thoughts. Agricultural success had always required a balance between tradition and adaptation, honoring established wisdom while embracing necessary change. Perhaps this unexpected family reunion and business proposition represented that same principle operating at a more personal level. The following day included visits to Chen Lux's flagship store on Fifth Avenue and a sustainable textile exhibition that the company was sponsoring, further contextualizing for Mason how his potential contribution would fit within the broader industry. Alexandra had arranged for him to meet with several other agricultural producers who had formed partnerships with the company, providing valuable perspective from those who had already navigated the transition he was contemplating. By the time Mason boarded his return flight to Willow Creek, his mind was largely made up. The partnership offered a viable solution to his immediate crisis, while establishing a path toward long-term sustainability, both financially and environmentally. It would require significant adaptation and learning. But agriculture had always demanded such flexibility. Most importantly, it would preserve the Reed legacy of stewardship, the connection to land that had defined his family for generations. 2 weeks after his return from New York, Mason signed the partnership agreement in the farmhouse kitchen, where his father and grandfather had made their own pivotal decisions about the farm's future. Alexandra was present, along with her legal team and brass sustainability director, bringing the formal structure of corporate processes into the informal setting of rural life. The immediate impact was practical. The looming foreclosure was averted, with Chen Lux's investment covering the outstanding mortgage payments and establishing an operating fund for the transition process. Soil testing began immediately, with agricultural consultants analyzing the optimal locations for initial cotton plantings and experimental fiber crops. As word spread through Willow Creek about the unusual partnership between a struggling local farm and an international fashion company, reactions were mixed. Some viewed it with skepticism, wary of corporate involvement in traditional agriculture. Others, recognizing the economic potential for a region that had faced steady decline, were cautiously optimistic. Henry Davidson, after reviewing the agreement at Mason's request, gave his qualified approval. "You've negotiated solid protections," he acknowledged, "and the environmental aspects align with changes the industry needs to make anyway. If it works, you could be pioneering a model other farms might follow." The fall and winter months were dedicated to planning and preparation. Mason found himself immersed in research about cotton cultivation and emerging fiber crops, consulting with agricultural specialists, and studying successful organic operations. Alexandra visited regularly, both to oversee the partnership's development and to continue exploring their family connection, often bringing historical documents or photographs she had discovered in her ongoing research about Eleanor Reed's life. Their professional relationship evolved alongside their personal one, developing a comfortable rhythm that balanced Alexandra's corporate efficiency with Mason's practical, hands-on approach to problem-solving. They made an effective team, her strategic vision complementing his intimate knowledge of the land and its capabilities. Spring brought the first visible transformations to the Reed farm. New irrigation systems were installed across the first-to-mine section designated for transition, utilizing water-conserving technologies that drastically reduced consumption compared to traditional methods. Solar panels appeared on the barn roof, generating clean energy to power the new systems. The farmhouse itself received long-overdue repairs and updates, maintaining its character while improving its functionality. The first cotton planting was a community event of sorts. with local farmers coming to observe the process despite their initial skepticism. Alexandra was present, having arranged her schedule to participate in this milestone moment. Watching her exchange easy conversation with Adelaide Davidson and other farm wives, Mason was struck by how naturally she seemed to navigate between her sophisticated corporate world and the straightforward rural community of his home. "Never thought I'd see cotton growing on reed land," Henry commented as they watched the planting equipment move methodically across the prepared field. "Your father was certainly committed to corn and soybeans." "Times change," Mason replied, echoing Henry's own words from months earlier. "Dad adapted in his way. This is mine." As summer progressed, the contrast between the transitioning sections of the farm and those still under conventional cultivation became increasingly evident. The organic cotton thrived under the careful management plan developed by Chen Lux's agricultural specialists in collaboration with Mason. The plants lush and healthy, despite minimal chemical inputs. Alexandra's visits to the farm became regular features of Mason's schedule, their business discussions often extending into shared meals and conversations that wandered beyond the partnership's parameters. During one such visit in late summer, as they walked the perimeter of a particularly successful experimental plot of hemp being evaluated for fiber production, Alexandra broached a new dimension of their collaboration. "Our marketing team has been developing concepts for a new collection that would highlight our sustainable sourcing initiatives," she explained. "They're particularly interested in featuring the Reed Farm partnership as a centerpiece of the campaign." Mason raised an eyebrow. "What exactly would that involve?" "Photography here on the farm, initially," Alexandra replied, "documenting the transition process, the contrast between traditional and innovative agricultural methods. Eventually, we'd like to develop a narrative around the human element as well, the story of a family farm evolving to meet contemporary challenges." The implication was clear. Mason himself would be part of this narrative. "Not sure I'm marketing material," he said dryly. "Don't exactly fit the fashion world image." Alexandra smiled. "That's precisely why you're perfect for this campaign. Authenticity is increasingly valuable in luxury marketing. Consumers want to know the real stories behind their purchases, the actual people involved in creating sustainable products." The concept was outside Mason's comfort zone, far removed from the practical agricultural work that had defined his life. Yet he recognized its potential value for the partnership, the way it might bridge the seemingly disparate worlds of rural farming and high fashion in the public imagination. "I'll consider it," he said finally. "Can't promise I'll be natural in front of cameras, but I understand the business logic." Alexandra's expression suggested she had expected this reserved response. "Think about it. There's no rush on the decision. The first harvest is still months away, and we'd want to capture that process before developing the broader campaign." The conversation shifted to more immediate concerns about irrigation adjustments needed for the approaching dry period. But the marketing concept lingered in Mason's thoughts. It represented another evolution in his role, from farmer to business partner to potential brand representative, each step further from the straightforward agricultural identity he had always assumed would define his life. That fall, as the first organic cotton harvest approached, Chen Lux arranged for a professional photography team to document the process. Mason, having reluctantly agreed to participate in the marketing initiative, found himself alternately farming as usual and pausing for photographs that captured the authentic work in carefully composed frames. The photographers, under Alexandra's direction, seemed to understand the importance of documentation that honored rather than romanticized agricultural labor. They captured the early morning preparations, the complex choreography of modern harvesting, equipment, and the moments of assessment when Mason evaluated fiber quality with the expertise developed over months of intensive study and practice. Alexandra herself was present for the entire harvest, her designer clothing replaced by practical workwear, as she immersed herself in the process, asking questions, taking notes, and occasionally assisting with minor tasks. Her genuine interest in understanding every aspect of the operation impressed even the most skeptical local farmers who had been hired to help with the inaugural harvest. "She's not what I expected," admitted Benjamin Carter, watching as Alexandra carefully examined cotton bolls for quality alongside Mason. Thought she'd be directing from the sidelines, but she's got her hands in it. Like the rest of us. She understands the value of direct experience, Mason replied. Can't truly know a process from reports and photographs alone. The first harvest exceeded projections in both yield and quality, a promising validation of the partnership's concept. Mason felt a satisfaction that transcended the relief of financial stability. A craftsman's pride in successful adaptation to new methods and crops. During the post-harvest analysis in the newly renovated farm office, Alexandra presented an expanded marketing concept that had Bassinar, evolved from the documentation process. The photography has captured something compelling, she explained, showing Mason selected images on her tablet. There's an authenticity here that resonates with what we're trying to communicate about sustainability and craft. Connection to origins. The photographs were striking, even to Mason's untrained eye. They captured the tension between tradition and innovation that characterized the transitioning farm. The weathered hands of experienced farmers, handling crops that represented agricultural evolution rather than surrender to development pressures. What we're proposing, Alexandra continued, is a comprehensive campaign built around the concept of rooted innovation. The Reed Farm would be the centerpiece, representing how traditional agricultural wisdom can be preserved and adapted rather than discarded in pursuit of sustainability. The marketing team's vision was more expansive than Mason had anticipated, including not just photography but video documentation, articles for fashion and sustainability publications, and, eventually, a limited collection of apparel inspired by workwear and rural aesthetics, but produced with the farm's sustainable fibers. And you want me as part of this, Mason stated rather than asked, studying images of himself working alongside the harvesting crew, his expression focused and unaware of the camera. Alexandra nodded. Your story is compelling, Mason. A fourth-generation farmer facing the very real challenges of modern agriculture, choosing adaptation over surrender. It embodies exactly what we're trying to communicate about sustainability, requiring both respect for tradition and willingness to evolve. The prospect was daunting, placing Mason in a public spotlight he had never sought or imagined. Yet he recognized the strategic value for the partnership, the way his participation might help bridge the perceived gap between rural agricultural communities and the urban consumers of luxury fashion. I'm not a model, he said finally. Not comfortable with pretense. That's exactly the point, Alexandra replied. We don't want fabricated imagery. We want the real story, with all its complications and authenticity. You wouldn't be playing a role, just allowing your actual experience to be documented and shared. After consideration, Mason agreed to the expanded marketing initiative, with specific conditions about how he and the farm would be represented. The documentation would be honest about the challenges and occasional setbacks of agricultural transition, not just highlighting successes. The narrative would acknowledge the economic pressures that had necessitated change without portraying the partnership as a corporate rescue of a failing enterprise. Alexandra readily accepted these conditions, recognizing that their alignment on authentic representation strengthened rather than compromised the marketing concept. Authenticity is what gives this campaign potential to stand out, she emphasized. Glossing over difficulties would undermine its credibility and impact. As winter settled over Willow Creek, planning for the next growing season proceeded alongside development of the marketing campaign. Mason found himself dividing time between agricultural research, infrastructure improvements, and occasional sessions with Chen Lux's creative team, who were developing the narrative framework for the rooted innovation concept. The campaign began rolling out in fashion and sustainability publications in early spring, coinciding with the second planting season of the partnership. The initial features focused on the agricultural transition process, with striking photography of the Reed Farm's transformation and thoughtful articles about balancing tradition with necessary evolution. Mason's involvement was presented with respectful authenticity, highlighting his agricultural expertise and commitment to the land, rather than attempting to glamorize him as an unlikely fashion figure. His straightforward perspectives on sustainability challenges contrasted effectively with the more polished corporate messaging, creating a multi-dimensional narrative that resonated with diverse audiences. Within the fashion industry, the campaign generated significant positive attention, praised for its substantive approach to sustainability rather than superficial greenwashing. Environmental publications that typically viewed luxury fashion with skepticism found themselves acknowledging Chen Lux's meaningful investment in agricultural transformation. More surprisingly, the campaign found traction in agricultural communities similar to Willow Creek, where farmers facing comparable economic pressures saw potential lessons in the Reed Farms adaptation. Mason began receiving inquiries from other small-scale farmers interested in exploring similar transitions, enough that Alexandra arranged for Chen Lux to host an informational symposium in Granville to share insights from their experience. 6 months into the campaign, as the second cotton harvest approached, Alexandra presented Mason with a new dimension of their marketing initiative. "We've been developing a limited apparel collection inspired by the partnership," she explained, showing him design sketches on her tablet. "Practical pieces that honor traditional workwear aesthetics, but incorporate innovative sustainable materials, including cotton from last year's harvest." The designs were sophisticated interpretations of classic rural work clothing, maintaining functional elements while introducing subtle refinements in cut and detail. Mason could recognize the influence of traditional farm garments, transformed through the lens of high fashion, but without losing their practical foundation. "The collection needs a name," Alexandra continued. "The creative team has been exploring various options, but I keep coming back to something simple and direct. Reed.it acknowledges both the family heritage that anchors the farm and the natural reed plants that have traditionally been used for sustainable fiber." End quote. The proposal caught Mason off guard, the idea of his family name becoming a fashion brand both flattering and slightly disorienting. "That's quite an honor," he said carefully. "But I'm not sure how I feel about commodifying the family name." Alexandra nodded understanding. "It's a significant step, one I wouldn't propose lightly. The name would be licensed, not transferred, with clear parameters about usage and representation. Your approval would be required for all applications." After consideration and consultation with Henry Davidson, who offered practical advice about intellectual property protection, Mason agreed to the naming proposal with specific contractual protections. The Red Collection would maintain authentic connections to agricultural heritage, with a percentage of proceeds dedicated to supporting sustainable farming initiatives beyond their specific partnership. The collection's development coincided with the second harvest, which further validated the partnership's agricultural approach with improved yields and fiber quality. As the harvesting process was again documented for the ongoing campaign, Mason found himself more comfortable with the presence of photographers and videographers. His initial self-consciousness replaced by pragmatic acceptance of their role in the broader partnership strategy. What he wasn't prepared for was Alexandra's next proposal, delivered during a quiet moment as they reviewed quality assessments of the newly harvested cotton. "The collection launch is scheduled for New York Fashion Week in February," she explained. "We're planning a presentation format rather than a traditional runway show, creating an immersive environment that communicates the story behind the garments." Mason nodded, familiar by now with fashion industry terminology that would have been foreign to him a year earlier. "Sounds effective. The creative director and I believe the presentation would be significantly strengthened by your presence," Alexandra continued. "Not as a model wearing the collection, but as yourself, the agricultural partner whose expertise and vision made it possible." The invitation represented yet another expansion of Mason's role, far beyond anything he had contemplated when signing the initial partnership agreement. Fashion Week in New York, presenting alongside designers and industry insiders, was so far removed from his experience that he couldn't initially formulate a response. "I understand it's outside your comfort zone," Alexandra acknowledged when his silence extended. "But your presence would underscore the authenticity that makes this collection meaningful. Without you, it risks becoming just another superficial interpretation of rural chic, rather than a genuine connection between agricultural innovation and conscious fashion." End quote. Mason eventually agreed, recognizing the strategic importance, while harboring significant reservations about his suitability for such an environment. The months leading up to Fashion Week included not just agricultural planning for the coming growing season, but also preparation sessions with Chen Lux's public relations team, coaching Mason on what to expect and how to effectively communicate the partnership's vision to fashion industry audiences. In February, Mason found himself in New York once more, this time not as an uncertain visitor, but as a key participant in one of the industry's most significant events. The Reed Collection presentation was housed in a converted industrial space designed to evoke both traditional rural contexts and innovative sustainability. Installations featuring video from the farm, physical examples of the fiber production process, and the garments themselves created a multi-dimensional experience for attendees. Mason's role was carefully constructed to honor his actual expertise, rather than casting him as an unlikely fashion figure. Stationed within a section highlighting sustainable agriculture, he engaged with attendees in straightforward conversations about the realities of transitioning traditional farming practices toward fiber production for luxury markets. The authenticity of this approach resonated powerfully with an industry increasingly concerned with substantive sustainability rather than surface-level gestures. Fashion journalists, initially attracted by the novelty of a fourth-generation farmer at Fashion Week, found themselves engaged by the depth of thought behind the partnership and its tangible environmental and economic impacts. The most compelling aspect of the Reed collection isn't the admittedly beautiful garments, wrote one influential critic, but the genuine connection to agricultural transformation represented by Mason Reed himself, whose practical knowledge and evident integrity provide a foundation that most sustainability initiatives in fashion conspicuously lack. The collection's success extended beyond critical acclaim to commercial performance, with pre-orders exceeding projections and retail partners requesting expanded distribution. This financial validation established the partnership's viability beyond its initial phase, confirming that the model could be both environmentally responsible and economically sustainable. For Mason, the Fashion Week experience was simultaneously exhausting and enlightening. An immersion in a world entirely different from his own, that nevertheless confirmed the value of the bridge they were building between urban consumption and rural production. When he returned to Willow Creek, he brought with him not just tales of an exotic industry event, but practical insights about consumer perspectives that informed the partnership's ongoing development. The third growing season brought expansion of their fiber production, with additional acreage transitioning to organic cotton and experimental plots dedicated to emerging sustainable fibers. The farm's transformation was increasingly visible, with modern infrastructure harmonizing rather than conflicting with its historical character. Solar arrays and advanced irrigation systems coexisted with preserved heritage structures, physical manifestations of the balance between tradition and innovation that defined the partnership. Alexandra's visits to the farm became more consistent, scheduled around agricultural milestones and planning needs, but also reflecting her growing personal connection to the property and its heritage. Their familial relationship, initially an unexpected complication in a business arrangement, evolved into a meaningful connection for both of them, a bridge between their otherwise divergent lives. During one such visit, as they walked the farm's perimeter at sunset, Alexandra shared news that would further expand their partnership's impact. "We've had inquiries from several other fashion houses about our sourcing model," she explained. "They're interested in establishing similar partnerships with farms in different regions." Mason nodded thoughtfully. "Makes sense. Models proving viable, both environmentally and financially. It creates an opportunity," Alexandra continued. "We could maintain this as a proprietary approach, exclusive to Chen Lux. Or we could facilitate broader adoption, helping other brands connect with farmers who might benefit from similar transitions." The question reflected a fundamental choice between competitive advantage and broader systemic change, business strategy versus environmental impact. Mason considered it carefully before responding. "Dad always said good farming practices should be shared, not hoarded. Same principle might apply here." Alexandra smiled. "I was hoping you'd say that, because I've been developing a concept for a separate entity that would facilitate these connections, a sort of clearinghouse for sustainable agricultural partnerships across the fashion industry." The vision she outlined was ambitious, a new organization that would match fashion companies seeking sustainable materials with farms looking to transition toward environmentally responsible fiber production. The entity would provide technical expertise, contract frameworks, and quality standards, ensuring that partnerships benefited both agricultural communities and fashion brands while maintaining rigorous SLI sustainability criteria. "I'd want you involved," Alexandra concluded. "Your perspective as a farmer who's navigated this transition successfully would be invaluable. Not full-time, obviously, as the reed farm remains your primary focus, but as an advisor, an occasional speaker who can communicate authentically with agricultural communities." End quote. The proposal represented yet another evolution in their partnership and in Mason's own professional identity, expanding his role from individual farmer to potential advocate for agricultural transformation on a broader scale. It was far from anything he had imagined for himself when struggling to save his farm from foreclosure just 2 years earlier. "Need to think about it," he said honestly. "Not natural for me, being any kind of spokesperson." Alexandra nodded understanding. "Of course. But consider that your very reluctance is what makes you effective. You speak from direct experience, without polish or exaggeration. That authenticity resonates with other farmers in ways that corporate sustainability experts never could." End quote. Over the following months, as the third harvest proved the most successful yet, and planning for the fourth growing season proceeded, Mason gradually accepted an expanded role in what became the Agricultural Renewal Initiative, a non-profit organization funded primarily by Chen Lux, but structured to serve the broader fashion industry's transition toward sustainable sourcing. His involvement began modestly, with occasional consultations on practical aspects of agricultural transition and review of materials developed for farmer outreach. Gradually, as his comfort level increased, he participated in informational workshops for farming communities facing economic pressures similar to those that had threatened the reed farm. These engagements required Mason to articulate aspects of farming that he had previously implemented through intuition and inherited knowledge, forcing him to codify and communicate practices that had been second nature. The process deepened his own understanding of agricultural principles, while developing his ability to translate between the specialized languages of farming and fashion. 4 years after Alexandra Chen had first appeared at the Willow Creek post office, the reed farm had transformed dramatically, while paradoxically remaining true to its essential character. The crops had changed, with organic cotton and experimental sustainable fibers replacing corn and soybeans. The infrastructure had modernized, with solar power, advanced irrigation, and a small processing facility that created local employment. Yet the fundamental connection to land, the stewardship ethic that had defined the Reed family for generations, remained intact and even strengthened through its evolution. Mason himself had undergone a parallel transformation, developing new agricultural expertise, business acumen, and communication skills while maintaining the pragmatic, hands-on approach that grounded his identity as a farmer. His role had expanded far beyond the boundaries of the Reed property, contributing to a movement that was gradually reshaping relationships between fashion consumption and agricultural production. Alexandra's professional evolution mirrored his own, her role expanding from fashion executive to advocate for systemic change within her industry. Chen Lux had established itself as a leader in substantive sustainability practices, with the Reed Partnership as cornerstone of its approach. While the Agricultural Renewal Initiative was facilitating similar transformations across diverse regions and brands, their personal relationship had deepened alongside their professional collaboration, the initially surprising family connection developing into a meaningful bond that bridged their different worlds. Regular visits, shared meals, and ongoing exploration of their family history created a relationship that was simultaneously familial and collaborative, personal and professional. On the 5th anniversary of their partnership, Alexandra visited the farm for what had become an annual tradition, a shared assessment of progress and planning for future development. They walked the property together, evaluating crop conditions and discussing potential adjustments for the coming season, the easy rhythm of their conversation reflecting years of collaborative decision-making. The farm was thriving, its renewed vitality evident in healthy fields, well-maintained infrastructure, and the overall sense of purposeful activity. What had once been a struggling operation on the verge of foreclosure had become a model of agricultural adaptation, demonstrating how traditional farming could evolve to meet contemporary environmental and economic challenges without surrendering its essential character. As they reached the highest point on the property, overlooking fields where diverse fibers grew in carefully managed rotation, Alexandra paused, her expression reflective. "I was thinking about that first day, when you offered me your spare sun hat at the post office. Such a small gesture. Yet look where it led." Mason nodded, remembering the moment that now seemed simultaneously recent and distant. Couldn't have imagined any of this back then. Was just trying to get through each day, keep the farm going somehow. "It's remarkable, isn't it?" Alexandra mused. "How something so simple can set such significant changes in motion. A random act of kindness to a stranger who turned out to be family, leading to all of this." She gestured toward the transformed landscape before them. Mason considered this, the unlikely sequence of events that had preserved and transformed his family's legacy. Dad used to say farming's all about faith, in a way. Planting seeds without absolute certainty they'll grow, but doing everything you can to give them the best chance. Perhaps that's true of all meaningful endeavors, Alexandra suggested. Whether fashion or farming, you plant seeds of possibility without guarantees, then nurture them as best you can. As they continued their walk, discussing specific plans for the coming growing season, Mason reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. What had begun with a simple sun hat, offered without expectation of return, had flowered into something neither of them could have anticipated. A partnership that honored tradition while embracing necessary change, preserving what was essential while allowing evolution. The Reed farm continued, adapting as it always had to changing times and circumstances. Its story enriched, rather than ended, by the unexpected connection between a struggling farmer and a fashion mogul searching for her roots. The legacy endured, not through rigid preservation, but through thoughtful evolution. The perfect balance of honoring the past while creating a sustainable future. In the farmhouse kitchen that evening, as they shared a meal prepared with vegetables from Mason's expanded garden, Alexandra raised her glass. In a toast to sun hats and unexpected journeys, she said with a smile. Mason nodded, raising his own glass to meet hers. And to roots, he added, both the ones we're born with and the ones we choose to nurture. Outside, the sun set over fields that had sustained generations of reeds and would now continue that tradition in new forms, the land's fundamental purpose unchanged despite its transformation. Inside, family once separated by circumstance and choice, found connection through shared purpose and mutual respect, their different worlds bridged by common values and complementary strengths. The simple straw sun hat that had started their journey hung on a peg near the door, weathered and practical, a humble object that had sparked an extraordinary transformation. Like the farm itself, it represented the beauty of ordinary things, given meaning through human connection and purposeful use, a reminder that the seeds of renewal can be found in the most unexpected moments of death. Generosity.